Greetings once again. Welcome to a presentation on the enticements of social transformation and inner world experience as a form of social transformation. Now, I would like to begin very briefly by describing what I hold to be the form by which the inner world is transformative of reality, and how I feel that it is equally important to the outer world in essence. Now, when we consider ourselves as self-identifying beings, that we are reflexive beings, that we reflect within ourselves and are identical to ourselves, that we see ourselves as something. The preconceived notion that we have about ourselves is part of how others see us as well. And there is this moment whereby we may oftentimes confuse ourselves with the other. And this idea stems from this sort of Jungian principle of psychological projection, which I want to abandon, not abandon entirely, but in part abandon, to sort of suggest that psychological projection can actually be something that has to do with self-realization, not necessarily a consideration of some kind of sociological change that is instantiated to a subject that makes them perform activities that are considered unethical, but rather the idea that when someone chooses to project their identities upon the other, they are seeking something emancipatory. They're seeking a form of emancipation from the constraints that they feel are upon them, such as those which are rational constraints, such as very normative activities of quotidian behavior that place self-identification in the process whereby it is insisting that it's perform these daily tasks as a daily regimen, and this notion of quotidian life being a framework for the way we apply ourselves in the process of our self-identification, whereas the notion that psychological projection is considered where there is, the situation where there is friction between the self and its other, and one is finding a scapegoat or blaming the other for the things that are happening to themselves as subjects. They feel it is necessary to sort of look at this breach of self-identification as an intrusion and someone that's an interloper, getting inside their heads and manipulating them in certain ways so as to arrive at a solution to their own life's problems. So the psychologist will say, if that is the case for the subject, that person, a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a psychoanalyst would say that person is projecting their own sense of a lack of identity or not knowing entirely who they are upon you. So once they're taken care of, you will no longer have that problem. So in the work of psychoanalysis, that is of course what they're doing. But what I'm suggesting here is that though that process is very notably in classical semiotics is considered to be a worthwhile thing to pursue in terms of the fact that this whole idea of inner self-realization, of the inner world, positing the world as such, in the same conceptual formation that identifies with the subject as a subject, and a world that is from what has been abstracted conceptually by the subject is this world which is represented to them. So they're able to reflexively identify with that world, which is the same world in which we all live, the world in itself, but is effectively held under in the framework of the concept that is being posited by the subject a priori, the presupposition, the notion they have, whereto they posit the world and identify with another process that I want to indicate that is perhaps something that is considered, part of a more radical enlightenment, the idea that nominal signification is inclusive of the notion that someone with which one has had contact can be signified to you, and in turn will return to you in certain moments in time without you requesting their presence, will attempt to engage you ontologically rather than the sort of part of the technological artifice being about a very direct engagement. It's that person because you can see it on your device, but in its stead, what you have here is you have an ontologization of this process of self-identification, whereby nominal signification, understanding the subject as an object, is present within the mind. So it's necessary in this particular instance to differentiate from the former, the notion that there would be sort of someone projecting upon you that was an interloper or trying to perform some sort of legerdemain in order to trip you in life's journey, to the latter, which is someone that that is trying to access you within your mind. And then there is, of course, everyone else that has to do with the conceptual formation, whereby the genus of the varying, what I would call objective unities, for they are objective unities whereby someone's quotidian practices are engaged with the same things they are doing consistently, day in, day out. The practices that with which they are engaged, with which an individual is engaged, that is not pursuing life as an individual necessarily, but pursuing life as part of a social engagement with their inner self-realization. So there's a difference, I believe, there, in that one would always have within the mind the notion that there would be a representation of the other. And it's just a matter of determining what the identity of the other, in a sense. And I think that when that is masked, that becomes the sort of alien identity. The part of the process of self-identification is noticing that barrier between self and world is perhaps, I won't say infected with an alien identity. I will say that rather the other is simply very particular to themselves and not part of the notion of the known subject-object, the nominal signification, someone of personal, empirical, outer experience that is posited within the mind and is noticed to be present within the consciousness. Such as would be the topic for something such as a memoir that someone would write. Otherwise, I believe the other is essentially a representation of what is of the same genus. And I will explicate this in some way. And essentially I take the Hegelian stance here, that I believe that because the self posits itself identical to itself, that would necessitate a negative condition in the other. It would necessitate that. For opposing forces in the universe are omniscient, omnipresent, more omnipresent than omniscient. I think omniscient is the notion that someone else would recognize the symbolic representation of a self that was engaging a similar genus to which they had already accompanied their own self-identification. So you would have this sense of colliding forces. One would certainly have the sense of colliding forces between self and other, and the process whereby the world was being engaged in the same conceptual framework that was posited by both minds. And it's not a matter of sort of two minds coalescing necessarily. It's a matter of the dialectical impetus to realize which presupposition is before the idea that is represented by the other. And it's not so much a function of the other must be sublated, removed, or kept, and held, but the notion that the other must be held within consciousness as their part of the representation of this that obfuscates what I call symbolic realism. Now, symbolic realism is it's not necessarily affiliated with the symbolist movement of the 19th century, the poets, the beginnings of the symbolist movement, or the work of Kant or Schopenhauer or Lacan, for instance. It's symbolic realism. It has to do with, nor is it, I should add, does it have to do with the very protected idea about freedom of religion and things of this sort. It has to do with the fact that someone that, from whatever standpoint they are engaging themselves as subjects, beings in the world, it is accompanied by the idea that there will be something that I call symbolic realism. And that is going beyond the notion, the Lacanian notion. Jacques Lacan, French psychoanalyst, Freudo-Hegelian philosopher perhaps, discussed the notion of the separation between the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real. So my endeavor with symbolic realism is to actuate something whereby someone's nominally signified subject. And this considers commitments to varying disciplines in some way, but I don't sense that it is anything other than, or anything less than, a fusion of something that must not necessarily be aggressively fused, which is just simply actuated by its own potential to be symbolically real, in that symbolic realism is a representation of that person that can be framed in a consciousness as being of the very certain genus based upon its nominal signifier, and then of the reproduction, the reproduction of the nominal signifier. So I would like to look at this idea of this word reproduction is not a word I want to include in the lexicon of what I'm addressing here, but I want to look at reproduction. But reproducibility certainly is the idea that, for instance, when someone is reproduced, someone is transmitting beyond that limit in the other that is signified as a self as well, and self-identical. Yet the way it represents itself to a subject is it represents itself in a very particular fashion. So it's extremely particular. It's non-identical. It's alien. There is no way to identify this representation as anything other than what it might be or what it potentially is. There's no way to assess epistemologically or onto-epistemologically the nature of this entity, this representation. There is no way to identify it, and there's no way to arrive at all the things that in the aforementioned, that I have suggested are possible of positing one's access to symbolic representations as such, as moments whereby one can experience a vision of the other, sort of the gold of consciousness, as it were, the emeralds of being, the treasure trove of ontology that is represented to the human mind, whereby one would simply insist on the fact that one would be less of a self if one were to accommodate anything other than the notion that it were possible to posit this other as something perfectly accessible. Yet where it concerns the notion of psychological projection, the things that have been noticed about how the points of contact and the friction and the cancellation would perhaps introduce notions of a problematic judgment, but I want to exclude that, in a sense, the notion of a problematic judgment, for I feel that those do fall into the auspices of self-identification, of subjective existential responsibility for the projection of others in the Jungian sense. But I want to abandon this idea that it is a problem to psychologically project self-identity upon another person, intersubjectively, interobjectively, and create an aesthetic experience that is part of what I hear called symbolic realism.